And here we are for another Thursday edition of Dualistic Unity Social. This is going to be the first of two because we had a guest reschedule for this afternoon. And so we're going to have two episodes of Dualistic Unity Social today, as we did last week, which was a lot of fun because we got to get into a conversation. We had an opportunity to let our community amplify that conversation, offer different perspectives and more insights. And then we got to continue on after that. Somebody love backpacking and heard y'all are throwing a camping retreat. When would that be? It's going to be next summer. That is the plan. It's going to be next summer on Vancouver Island. The details are not released as yet because we are still, in fact, working on our tickets for the Netherlands retreat that is coming up on November 11th. I am stoked. And ever since we did the announcement that we are not going to be going to Australia in April, as we had hoped to be doing, the Netherlands retreat really is the only 9-day event that you can attend in the near future if you're looking for that 9-day meals cooked for you, sitting in a comfortable place, having a wood-fired hot tub, and a massive community of people who just want to be vulnerable and authentic. If you're looking for that whole 9-day experience, the Netherlands retreat is definitely where you want to be. It's incredible. And there's going to be a roundtable episode released later on today where we actually had 3 previous guests talking about the retreats. So I won't get into it here, but let's just say, don't waste time. If you can make it to this event, definitely do. It's going to be life-changing for everyone, including me.
Yeah, likewise. And so, yeah, if you're interested, that roundtable will have a lot of great information. There's been a couple roundtables with people who have been to retreats in the past that give great just explanations, because it's not the easiest thing to necessarily describe, because every retreat's different. Every retreat is based on everyone who's there. Like, the people who come make the retreat what it is. So we can't really say this structured idea of what it is, what you're going to get out of it, how it's going to go, how it's going to impact you in your life. Like, we can't say that with any degree of certainty. So it's the willingness to find out yourself. And even just going to a retreat is a leap in, takes a degree of faith in yourself to just find out and see what could change. You've held on to this specific idea of yourself and the way you view things for a while, and you've kind of seen how that works. You recognize there's consequences to doing it. You suffer to a degree. So might as well figure out if there's a different way you could see things, right? And so there's nothing to say that you'll see it in a specifically different way, but even just a shift is enough to let go of the certainty that you hold on to, that the way you see yourself and the way you see your life is objectively true. And it's just that shift, just the maybe it's not. Maybe this isn't the all and everything. Maybe my perspective isn't the absolute truth. Maybe the way I see myself isn't the only way that I'm ever seen. Maybe it's not. And that shift is oftentimes enough to, change your fucking lives, like to change your life. Just that shift, just the willingness to wonder if maybe the thing I feel like I'm so sure about isn't certain, isn't true. It's not saying that something else is certain. That's oftentimes what happens. Oh, this isn't certain. Let me go find the thing that is certain. There is no thing that's certain. It's ever changing, as are you. You are ever changing. So there's no specific idea you could even adequately settle upon to any degree, with any degree of truth. If everyone sees you differently, like, your perspective isn't correct. It's not the truth, because it's not the only one. It's just a limited, tiny little perspective. And so the retreats allow you to dig into that, the recognition that not everything that you believe to be the absolute truth is the absolute truth. And, the subtlest shift can totally change your life.
Yeah, and I want to address that because this is something that comes up a lot. And you mentioned uncertainty and the fact that everything is always changing. And this is the reason that overcommitting to thought as a way of kind of, being on the ball, making sure that you know all of the moving parts, making sure that you feel certain about what's coming, using thought in order to have a certainty as to who you are becoming or where you are going or the impact it's going to have or what it means about you or any of these things. It's all based on this fictitious belief that we can achieve certainty, that at some point we can think our way to understanding, and then things aren't going to shift. And that won't ever happen for a number of reasons. Things are always changing, but not just that, we're always changing, which means that any understanding that we come to at any given point about anything, ourselves or the world or anything, is always going to be dictated by our level of self-understanding, right? And as our self-understanding continues to change, then our perspective of everything else can continue to change. This is the thing about the conversation about God, right? Like your understanding of God will always be limited by your understanding of yourself. Right? Now, it's kind of tongue in cheek when we say that because you're talking about the same thing, right? But you don't necessarily know that because again, you can only see things from your current level of understanding. So we're trying to grasp onto this certain idea of what we are rather than embracing the ongoing process of growth and change and intelligence. We're trying to get to a point where I understand now rather than being the process of understanding from moment to moment to moment to moment, because that's a practice in itself, right? That's a practice of ongoing awareness, of ongoing responsibility, of ongoing humility, of ongoing non-judgment, right? Because all of those things reduce your clarity. They reduce your ability to be aware from moment to moment to moment to moment. And in being that aware, in being empathetic, in having the sensitivity to what's happening, you forge an entirely different path in your life. Whereas if you're trying to settle on certainty, all you're doing is getting locked in place over and over and over, and then grudgingly having to let go of that false certainty to allow life to teach you, because otherwise you end up in conflict. And so it's interesting that we're always working against what we are at our very best by trying to settle on this idea of certainty, by trying to settle on this idea of this is what I am, this is what this is, as opposed to this ongoing recognition of a deeper and deeper sensitivity to what it is to be what we are, to exist.
And we're contorting reality every time we we focus on that. Like, I have to figure out the situation. I have to see it in a certain way that is certain, so you're not looking at it. You're not continuing to look. It's veiled every single time. It's foggy. It's not it as you try and figure it out. And as you get caught in focusing on the dialogue, on the processing of thoughts, the things that you're going through, focusing on the machine of thought, taking believing that there's any degree of truth that it's coming to, that it's getting to. So you focus on it because you're just like, well, I'm gonna keep going until it's true, until it's certain, until I know. And it never gets to that point. It's just this everlasting processing of it. It's not like there's never an endpoint with it. It's just an ongoing thing. But as we focus on it, we think that that thing is going to get to an endpoint at some time. And that illusion of it getting to a spot in which what? Like, in which what? In which experience ceases to be until we're at absolute comfort, is until, things stop changing, until things are exactly as I want them to be because I'm afraid? Like, what would happen if that was the case? That you don't even want that, but you'll keep buying into it because it gives you something to do, something to think that you're getting to. But there's so much weight that comes with that. And so as you focus on that processing that's going on, like, you're not seeing reality. You're totally missing experience itself. So it's not to say that there's anything wrong necessarily with doing so, but you're just not looking at what is. You're just not looking at reality when you're focused on the thoughts, thinking that that's, getting you anywhere, getting you to a point. It's just a component of the process, and there's nothing wrong with them, but it's just a component. It's not the end all be all. Like, reality is what's happening. Like, it's what's going on, and it's not your opinion of what's happening. That's such a limited perspective. You can't even begin to express how limited of a point of view that is. And if you believe that it's the truth, you're cutting yourself off from reality itself.
And isn't that interesting? Because we don't necessarily look at it that way. Because again, like thinking is so heavily valued as what separates us from the animal kingdom, of what makes us special. Humans can think, and therefore we are more intelligent. And it's like, the capacity to do something doesn't mean that we're doing it well. Right. I think that we forget that. It's like humans can think. That's what makes us awesome. It's like you can walk too, but it doesn't mean you can walk well. Like walking into walls repeatedly doesn't sound very awesome, whereas walking in a field sounds great. Being able to think while you're continuously causing yourself more fucking suffering doesn't sound like a very intelligent gift, right? And it's not that we have to use it that way. It's just that we've learned to use it that way, and we've learned to use it that way just through overcommitment. It's all it is. It's like I can think about myself. I can think that you don't like me. I can think that you don't like the way that I'm speaking. I can think that you're judging me for this and this and this and this and this. And my whole day is going to be changed by how seriously I take those thoughts. But if I'm afraid, I need to feel I know what's going on, which means that I need to believe that what I'm thinking is probably true because it solves that uncertainty. And isn't that sad? Because that's exactly what happens. We believe the thought because it promises false certainty. And we don't recognize that that false certainty puts us into conflict with reality because now we're telling ourselves a story that wouldn't exist otherwise. I could spend all day long worried that you don't like me as a person, and you might not be thinking that at all. And it would still change my whole day. Why? Because I take thinking too seriously. Because the alternative is that I don't know how you feel about me. And then I'm left with how I feel about myself. And that's where I can grow. But I can't get there if I'm always settling on false certainty because it never gives me the time or the space to self-reflect or be self-honest. Because I'm always just looking for a cessation to my pain. I'm always just looking for some way to alleviate my confusion and my need to settle on something that tells me I know what the fuck is going on. When in fact, all I'm doing is settling on a false certainty that is causing the suffering that I'm actually trying to run from. And how much are we just caught in that loop?
So incredibly caught. And how often we use other people to just pass off the responsibility of how we feel about ourselves onto them. Like you said, like you're left with yourself. You're left with the realization that these things you're afraid of, the assumptions that other people are making about you, the judgments, the assumptions of the judgments that other people are making about you are just yours. They're just your own. It's always just your own. And we're passing it off thinking that, oh, they're definitely doing that, not realizing like how simplistic it is in a sense. It's incredibly complex in another sense, but it's so simplistic in that I have a perception of myself. I see myself in a certain way. I assume that everyone else sees me in that way. So they must be thinking this if they have this point of view. And then because they must be thinking that, I feel bad. But it's just myself making myself feel bad because I'm passing off that responsibility for how I feel, my point of view of myself, my idea of myself onto everyone else. It's like avoiding responsibility and cutting off my ability to live freely, cutting off my ability to feel free in myself by believing wholeheartedly that everyone else sees me in the same way I see myself. And so therefore, when they look at me, someone could just give you a look. You're like, "Oh, they're judging me for this." Does that happen to be something that you judge yourself about? Does that happen to be something that you don't like about yourself? Does it? Oftentimes, if not basically always, that's the case. It's something that you already don't like or you already judge yourself for. So it's always just that perspective of yourself that is getting reinforced, and you're using your ideas of other people to either avoid or reinforce that assumption. And the way you see other people, the way you see them and what they're going through is just your own assumption relative to yourself. You know, how they're doing in life. You assume, oh, their life is amazing. Oh, they're this way, they're that way. Just reinforcing that, your life sucks relative to that. Like even the assumption that other people don't go through shit like you do. It's like everyone's going through shit all the time. Other people are dealing with their own shit, like their own entire stuff, and you're over here thinking they're making all of these judgments about you. It's like they're just in their own little fucking world going through stuff in their own life. Like they're going through shit no differently than you go through shit. They're concerned no differently than you're concerned. And we can make this assumption. I can make this assumption that no one else is going through anything. And when you start to take that in, that everyone else is going through stuff, it's not like it's only you going through shit. Like everyone's going through a number of things in their life that have absolutely nothing to do with you. And so the perspective that people are even considering you that often is a very egotistical assumption. It's incredibly egotistical to think that people are spending that much time focused on you and your life and how you're living it, and assuming that your perspective of how they're viewing you is correct is just a ridiculous thing. And yet I do it all the time.
That's it. We perceive people to be thinking like we do. And so if I'm constantly focusing on myself and how I'm living and whether I'm doing right, then I perceive everybody else is thinking about me in the same way. Like if I'm in a constant state of self-judgment and self-analysis, then I perceive everybody else to be doing the same thing because all I'm perceiving is what's happening in my own mind. I'm just projecting it onto everybody else. And so the more you're thinking about yourself, the more you're trying to become something, the more you're trying to make everybody see you in a certain way, the more you're doing all that, the more you start to think that everybody wants you to. Right? The more you start to think that you actually have to. And you convince yourself of that. You actually convince yourself that people are judging you by the same standards that you judge yourself. And why? Well, because the alternative is questioning your thoughts. The alternative is uncertainty. The alternative is to just admit you don't know and that your relationship with yourself is really all you can know. Right? But we get so twisted out of shape in trying to validate ourselves through the perspective of others, only ever making assumptions about what those perspectives are, which is terrifying and terrible. And it's such a terrible way to live because you end up in this place where you're constantly chasing and you can never really get, because if you're looking for validation through someone else and that person, let's say they give it to you. Let's say that person gives you the validation that you're looking for. They're like, yeah, you're beautiful. Yes, you're smart. Oh my God, you're such a great speaker. Whatever it might be. That's going to last for a very short period of time until you're left to your own devices again, where nobody's there to validate you, and then you don't believe them anyway.
Yeah, it's like it has a half-life almost. Like it wears down that external perspective because you can hear it, and if you have a very strong perspective of yourself, you can hear someone straight up say something to you explicitly and not believe it and assume they're lying and make this assumption that they're not telling you that. And it's so funny how we can have that. Like, take for example someone even just very basic, like, I like you, I don't like you. Like, you can so easily hear someone say, I like you, and assume they're lying. And then you can hear someone say, I don't like you, and think it's like objective truth. Meanwhile, it could just be their perspective is driven by, jealousy. Maybe they see you in a certain way and they're jealous of something, and so they say they don't like you. And if you were able to recognize, like, if they explicitly were to say, which never happens, like, I don't like you because I'm jealous of you for this very specific reason, like, oh, huh, so that's just entirely coming from them. It doesn't have the same sort of gravity. But if someone says I don't like you and you aren't willing to even look at that and wonder, oh, maybe this is coming from something. Maybe they're, trying to purposely make me feel worse so they can feel a little bit better about themselves. Maybe anything. Maybe they're seeing me in a very specific way that reminds them of someone else, and it really has nothing to do with me. Like, they're seeing a different person, like, than you see. They're seeing a different person than the other person who likes you or the other person who's never met you sees. And this is top of mind because I just filmed a video before this walking around talking about this, that like people see different people when they look at you. Like everyone sees a different person when they look at you. That is mind blowing. That it's just, and like this whole week I've mentioned it a few times, but it's the most freeing thing, but the most potentially overwhelming because you're just
It's just you.
it's
You're just left with
just
you.
ah,
This is the reason I don't fear judgment, is because frankly, any judgment's not the truth. And the only reason I can say that with accuracy is because I've actually looked at my own judgments enough to recognize where they come from. See, that's the thing, is that we can tell people all day that judgments don't hold truth, and they're not going to get it because they still value their own. Right? So it's important to kind of look through your own until you recognize, like, oh shit, I'm just trying to feel better. Oh, just validating choices. Oh God, I'm only, and that's what it is. And then finally, you're just like, so I'm never really looking at that person. Like my judgments aren't ever the truth. Like they're always kind of short-sighted. Like you could look at somebody who's homeless and just make all kinds of assumptions about that person, and yet you take that person, you put them in a job, you change their life entirely, and they'll show you an entirely different person. Right. And it's so funny that we do this all the time based on how people are dressed, based on how people talk, based on everything. We make assumptions about these people, and we actually operate on the assumption that those assumptions hold merit or are truth. Right. And it's not to necessarily say that you can't glean details. It's that we take those details and we create a full-blown story that we don't question. Right. And if we did question, then it would be easier for us to actually see more of what it is we're experiencing. But again, to do that, you have to come back to the fact that it's just your relationship with you. Right. And it's not until you stop trying to be something that you start to actually recognize what you are. But the same is true for everything else, for everyone else. It's not until you stop trying to make them or make it into something to suit your narrative that you actually start to see what it is.
yeah, well said. And that realization, I mean, that's where the responsibility comes in, and that really shifts it when you recognize that, yours are coming from somewhere. Like yours aren't the truth. Like your perspective of someone else is just as limited of a perspective as their perspective of you, your perspective of you, your perspective of them. But yeah, fuck, if you're unwilling to look at your own, you're not gonna see that anyone else's also doesn't hold merit. Like they kind of go hand in hand. And if you're willing to question your own and wonder that, like I've had that conversation with people like, oh, well, my perspective is all I have. Perception is reality. Perspective is reality. Or my perspective is my truth. Like, oh my God, that's such a limited point of view to think but if you only see yourself as that, then of course it's all you could possibly even fathom, and you're not even willing to consider that someone else may have another perspective because that's the extent with which you're willing to look. It's uncomfortable to see that someone else may have just as valid of a perspective of something as you. But it's kind of mind-blowing that someone will hold on to that belief like, "Oh, my perspective is my truth." It's like, "Yeah, but it's not the truth." It's like, that's very, very important to realize. Like, your perspective is the extent to which you can see things, but it's not the truth. But if you're not willing to see that, then you're not gonna question it. And you hold on to every perspective that you have, which includes your perspective of someone else's perspective. So to you, that person's perspective is the truth because your perspective of their perspective is the truth. But it's not. But it's only if you're willing to question your own perspective and realize that just because it's, quote unquote, your truth doesn't mean it's the truth ever. And it's not even close. It's not even a smidge. It's like a speck of a speck of a speck. And so therefore it's not. And it can never be.
I always find it interesting when people are like, well, all I have is my perspective. It's like, which one? because they seem to be thinking perspective is like this stagnant thing, and it's not. I mean, you felt one way about yourself when you woke up this morning, and you feel a different way about yourself by the time you get to dinner. And there are infinite amount of different ways that you felt about yourself throughout that, right? About yourself, about the world, about the people you were interacting with, your ability to interact with those people. All of those are different perceptions. So which one exactly is the truth? Right? And you could easily go, well, the one that makes me feel good. And that's what people normally do, is the one that makes me feel good, right? But they're all valid from from the point of view of the perceiver. In other words, if you hate yourself, that perspective seems like the truth while you're perceiving it. If you love yourself, that perspective seems like the truth while you're perceiving it. But that's the point. Perception always seems like the truth from the point of view of the perceiver. But if there's infinite perceptions of yourself and everything else that are available to you at any different point in the day, because remember, it's not like what I'm saying is like in the morning you're going to feel one way, in the afternoon you're going to feel another way every day. In the morning you might feel great one day, feel terrible another day. Like that's the whole thing, is that it's not about time or anything like that. You always have all of these options about what perspective of yourself in the world you'd like to choose. They're all there. And if they're all there and they're all valid from the perspective of the perceiver, then none of them are complete. None of them are complete and whole in themselves, which means none of them are the truth. They're simply valid as a perspective. And that's kind of what helps to understand that, is to just recognize that perspective is never the truth. Perception is never the truth. It's just an angle. It's just a way of perceiving what is, by perceiving yourself in a certain way, because you are what is.
Yeah, so it's the ability to utilize it without squeezing it so tightly, because that's the other side of it, is like, especially I've been on some of the Patreon calls we've been on, like it's just like when uncertainty hits you to a certain degree, like it shakes you enough, you're like, "Oh my god, I'm not certain about anything." Like I can't be certain about anything. My point of view is never objectively true, but it doesn't mean that you can't have one. Like there's nothing wrong with having one. It's just how tightly you squeeze it. Cause but I don't like sometimes when it's uncertain enough, I guess that comes down to having faith in yourself, like the recognition that I can be uncertain and never be sure of anything, but it doesn't mean I can't still do things. And with this attachment to feeling like I have to know or I have to have some degree of certainty in order to do something, like that's just bullshit. That's just an illusion, but it's been such a massive component of my life for so long that I feel like I have to know to some degree. Oh, I have to have some certainty in order to take action. It's like, no, you can just step into things. You can just interact without maintaining this solid perspective of yourself, someone else, how you're being perceived, but just the fact that we got a bunch of people watching this on in different places, like they're all hearing me differently. They're all seeing me entirely differently from each other. Like they're seeing a different person, which is incredibly freeing. The most freeing thing you could you can recognize, at least for me right now, it's up there, but it's insane. So the fear, the concern, the worry about how it's happening when you even right now, like I'm seeing all the perspectives, all of them being different. Like it can be overwhelming, but it's kind of as you expand it out, it just kind of goes like a poof. Like you can't know any of them ever with absolute certainty. They're all entirely different. And so you might as well just keep stepping through. And that means that your perspective is also incorrect. So as these assumptions come up, and oh my God, the back and forth I've been going through for the last week or two of just like holding on to some certainty and just going through a whole thing and then be like, oh yeah, my thoughts are incorrect. Like I don't know that. I don't know that. And it just so happens to be a way that I'm viewing myself right now. My concern about how something's happening or how someone's viewing me just so happens to line up with a way I'm feeling about myself in that exact moment. And the certainty I hold on to. But then I'm like, oh yeah, but I don't know that. And it falls off. But the back and forth is incredible because it's always right there. But it's just that. Like that is the weight. Like I think I'm correct about this, and therefore I must act according to that perspective, that specific perspective, as opposed to this is one perspective that can inform something, but it isn't the end all be all. And so it's not like a shackle as much as it's just another perspective that maybe you haven't seen previously or looked at. But it's not the end all be all truth. And so then you can actually take it into consideration. Like if someone judges you, if you're not judging yourself, you can see that as just feedback. Like, oh, that's a potential perspective. It doesn't mean that it's what I am. It doesn't mean it means something about my value, but it is an alternative way of viewing something. And so then you're just taking in more considerations. But as more considerations start to flood in, if you pick one out and you're like, oh, that's the truth, there's like an immediate weight to that kind of sits on top of you, weighs you down. But it's just another consideration that can be used as information that you can utilize. Unless you take it as objective truth, then it's not really something you can utilize. It's something that you have to deal with and face and overcome and get rid of this thing because this is it. Like, no, it's just perspective. It's skating by. It's just something you can look at without holding on to so goddamn tightly.
But that's it. It's just not holding on to it so tightly. So this is the thing. Like we talk about false certainty and people start thinking like, "Oh, okay, so I don't want to do that." So you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice. If you want to make a plan for tomorrow, you are under the false certainty that tomorrow is going to go in a certain way or that you're going to survive the night. Like we operate on false certainty all the time. It's how we operate. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that we get so caught up in it that we actually start creating wars over it. We actually start creating conflict over it. We get so frustrated by our expectations. We get so upset. We get so disappointed. Why? Simply because we take those false certainties and we hope that they're actual certainties. Instead of recognizing it's just the best guess with what I know right now. Everything after this moment is an unknown. And we forget that or we willingly block it out. But anything that you want to do from here on, if you're planning it from here, you don't fucking know. And how much does that bother you? Because that's the point. How much does it bother you that you don't really know? And we get really caught up in trying to know, to feel that we do know, to guarantee that it's going to happen in a certain way. We get caught up in planning and trying to control. And it's all simply because we don't want to accept that we're okay adapting as we go, that we actually are intelligence in action all the time. We want to try and think to ourselves, how do I make the most of my life? Not recognizing that's the distortion that makes it difficult to do so. Right? That you are in fact always learning from each and every moment. And if you were thinking about your progress less, you would have more attention for what it is you're learning from moment to moment to moment. You don't need to be thinking about it to learn from it. Right? You learned how to catch a baseball. You didn't think to yourself each and every time that ball was thrown at you, okay, I'm going to try it a little to the right this time. I'm going to try a little to the left this time. Because if you did that, you'd never catch the fucking ball. Because the direction's always changing. The ball's never thrown the same way twice. Right? So it can never be caught the same way twice. So you can't operate in the world that way, but you're still learning. You're still changing. You're still adapting. You're in fact learning how to catch the ball just by being part of the process, which means not thinking about it, not doubting yourself, just allowing yourself to do it until it becomes part of what you do. This is true for everything, whether it's an interview, whether it's learning to drive a car, learning a sport, learning how to talk to people. The less you think about yourself doing it, the more attention you have for the learning how to do it. You're always learning until you tell yourself you're not. And then what you've done is you've taken the lesson that you're learning and you've covered it over with a big smear of shit. And you're wondering why you can't get anything out of it.
And it's anytime we focus on ourself as we're doing something that gets in the way of it happening accordingly. And I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the podcast before, but one thing, like, sports were always a big part of my life. I was very athletic growing up, like pretty good at them, played baseball in college. I dealt with mental things with sports, like starting in high school and kind of stayed with me through college. And they had big impacts on me. And so, like, one of the biggest things was when I was 16. I pitched, I played infield, and I more or less got the yips. For anyone who knows what this is, it's basically, at least for baseball, like, you forget how to throw a ball. Despite playing since I was 4 or 5 years old, you get so caught in yourself that you start analyzing how to do it. Like, Ray uses the example of catching a ball, and it's like you don't think about it. But if you were to think about it, you get right fucked up. And so that happened to me. It was still, it's like a fucking experience, a memory I'll never forget. I had a high school coach who was a fucking asshole. He was just a dick, and would throw tantrums in the dugout, freak out, like he was. And so there was a day at practice where he was walking behind the kid I was playing catch with, and there was a concern, hesitation, like, oh, I don't want to throw it over and like hit my coach. And so it like created this feeling, and I still, like, it's not something I've necessarily totally overcome. I dealt with it and I was able to keep playing for, another 7 years, but it and so basically after that I started thinking about how to throw, and it never fully necessarily went away, and there was always the concern of how it was gonna go, as opposed to just being this thing that I didn't think about. Like, I had a very accurate arm up until that point. I pitched, and there was no kind of thoughts about how is this happening, and it got so extreme. That's why I almost quit baseball before college, and then I've talked about this before, but the summer that I got recruited and got a lot of interest from coaches was the summer basically. And so before I get into that, like, and I know we don't have too much time, so I'll probably continue this on in Patreon after this, but and in another chat. But that summer before, so basically with the arm fear of throwing, it brought in all this other concern. And like, there was a lot that came from that, a lot of self-judgment, a lot of self-criticism, a lot of just fear, basically. And I didn't know what it was when it first happened. I was like, I think I hurt my arm or something, not realizing that this was an entirely mental, value-based thing that I was going through. Like, that is where I derive some value from, being a good baseball player, having an accurate arm, and now it's falling apart right in front of my eyes. And so it then trickled into everything that I did. And so I was basically like looking at schools to, instead of looking to play baseball, I was like, oh, I'll do track, because I can run pretty fast, and there isn't that need for all of those other things to do that I'm now like are crumbling before me. And so it was that summer that I decided, like, I was gonna start doing track. And so I started caring less about baseball, about how I did. And I basically got to a point where I was like, all right, I'm about to quit, so fuck it. I'm just gonna play and see how it goes and not think about how I'm doing almost at all. And then of course things started going really well. And I that was the shift, was like, I don't care how I do anymore. Like, I didn't care at all. And all of a sudden all these, D1 coaches are like, hey, we'd love to have you, because I was playing free. I
It's
had
like you don't
no
care about what you think of how you're doing. Isn't that funny? It's like I don't care about how I think I'm doing. And so now you're doing.
exactly. Exactly. There was no because there was no focus on any outcome. It's like, I'm just here. Let's see what happens. And it wasn't like it was such a lack of yeah, it was a lack of concern for how I was doing that shifted everything. And then I was, played in college and but that's the thing is like that underlying sort of thing didn't necessarily go away. Like I ended up moving in high school to the outfield because when I was making a throw that was further, there was less, specific need to throw it. If you're in the infield, you got to throw it to first base. That has to be pretty fucking accurate. When you're in the outfield, you can kind of like you can throw a one hop, you can do all these other things, and so I was able to kind of deal with it without fully facing it necessarily and kind of keep patching it up. But it impacted me in a lot of different ways, and it was very much another way that I, reinforced myself and how I was doing and what I was going through. And it was all just this idea that, this is a bad thing to happen. Making a bad throw is a bad thing, and it means something about me, and it means and so like I forget how heavy that was, but it was a daily thing because I kept playing, and so it was something I had to face every day, and it was like this weight and fear and concern and consideration that I dealt with for fucking years, like years.
And largely because of somebody who took the game super seriously rather than it being a game. Right. And so we start to take it seriously. And the only way that we can account for something serious is to try and get control over it. And then it just gets worse. I don't want to cut you off, but we do have to wrap up for the time being. We are going to continue on in 15 minutes, so I want to explore this conversation more. We did talk about this on the podcast at one point. We did get into the yips. I don't remember where it was, but I believe it was in season 4 or 5. Anybody who knows on Discord, do let us know because that always helps. If you would like to join us for the next conversation, it's going to be an hour and a half. It's a tier 2 call. There is a 7-day free trial available on our Patreon page for a tier 2 membership, which means that you can join us for 5 days a week of group discussion. So patreon.com/dualistic unity. This has been a great conversation, man. I really appreciate that that you got into this a little bit more because I think everybody goes through that in one way or another. Some of us it's writing, some of us it's sports, others it's being able to study where you just can't get out of your head and your studies continue to fall and get worse. And it's always the same. We do really well until all of a sudden we start over analyzing our progress, and then we just lock ourselves into position, and then we judge ourselves for it, and that makes it even worse. And what we don't get is that while we can conquer that in some ways or learn to cope with it, if we don't recognize what's happening, it'll come into other parts of our lives as we get older, and then it becomes a dominant theme, which is another problem entirely. So do join us on Patreon if you can. If not, check out the Dualistic Unity podcast, season 1. We talk about all of this. We really do get into depth on a lot of these topics about thought and the usefulness of it, as well as the danger. So thanks so much, man. This has been a lot of fun.
It has. All right. Talk to you soon. See everyone soon.